And this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, bullish sentiment is growing around Bitcoin as the price holds above a key level. Are investors shaking off worries about safety and regulation? Plus, Peter Thiel looks to China for investments amid escalating tensions between the world's two largest economies. We will bring you details on where Thiel may expand his portfolio. And as global cybersecurity threats ramp up, Cloudflare is working across the U.S. to prevent hackers from interfering in upcoming elections. We will speak with CEO Matthew Prince. But first to our top story, is Bitcoin bouncing back? 2018 was a rough start for Bitcoin and many other cryptocurrencies, but they've been experiencing a rebound of late. The world's most valuable digital currency passed the $7,500 mark this week for the first time in a month. Prior to that, a sector-wide sell-off had erased $42 billion from its market value. The rise comes at a time that questions still remain about the safety of digital assets and looming regulation. Joining us to discuss, I want to welcome the CEO of Blockchain, Peter Smith, and in London we have Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde. Peter, I'll start with you. Do you think this rebound is here to stay? Is this the beginning of something longer term?
I think over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of really rapid increases, then very rapid decreases, then sort of a slow consolidation of the market. I think we're seeing another slow consolidation of the market now, and we're likely to see like a very sort of moderate but positive price consolidation over the next quarter.
So what's going to make the difference?
I think now in the market you have a lot of regulatory clarity that didn't exist even a year ago. You have a lot of sort of different types of order flow. So rather than just retail, you have some institutional. And as that institutional flow increases, particularly with the rollout of new institutional products, you'll see more of a level off and a consolidation in the market.
Caroline, you talk to a lot of investors. Do they seem to think we've hit bottom?
I think a few are starting to say it. I mean, very notable VC investor in the space. It's Barry Silbert, of course, well renowned in the digital currency area. He's saying, look, we have hit a bottom. In fact, the bears have run out of Bitcoin to sell. He's been getting in with his own money, he said, in the last week. And many feel that this could consolidate up to a much higher price at the moment. I mean, we've had another billionaire, that's the likes of Mark Lazary, saying, look, this could go to $40,000. But look, we could also see a sell-off. It's interesting that at the moment I'm looking at Bitcoin in particular, of course, the biggest crypto asset out there, currently is up about 18% on the week if you look at a GTV chart for that. But it's one of the only ones that holding really onto its gains of the week. If you're looking at Ethereum, we're seeing Ether sell off to a certain extent today. We're seeing Ripple come back down off of the highs that we saw earlier in the week. And volatility is likely to still be there. Arthur Hayes is the CEO of the crypto exchange BitMEX saying, look, current bull run may yet give way to a $5,000 yet downturn, but in the long term, we're heading higher. Check out maybe 50,000 in the future.
Peter, what is the trading volume that you're seeing and new account activity, if you will?
I think right now you're seeing a pretty slow retail market, and historically the market's been led by retail. You are seeing a pretty big uptick in the institutional market, and that's a lot of the reason why Bitcoin's outperforming. Institutions, when they're coming into the crypto market, are usually buying Bitcoin first. And so I expect Bitcoin to outperform relative to the other major cryptos over the next 6 months. But a lot of that has to do with the infrastructure you have to build to enable some of these institutions to come into the market.
And you've been adding new institutional services. How are they working and where do you see expanding?
I think we see expanding into the institutional market in the U.S. So a big focus right now is bringing some of the institutional grade products into the U.S. market. The challenge with institutions is it's a very long cycle. And so while there's a lot of talk about institutions coming into crypto market right now, I don't think we'll see the full effect until mid-2019.
And what's the appetite for risk? I mean, we were talking about crypto insurance yesterday. There's still a lot of concerns, you know, especially if you overstate your insurance. There's still a lot of risk involved.
Yeah, there's a lot of risk involved. I think it'll maintain a pretty small part of people's portfolio, particularly on the institutional side. That said, the crypto market is still pretty small. When you benchmark it against any major asset class, the crypto market, even Bitcoin itself, is still a pretty niche market.
Now, Caroline, there's so much hype about crypto assets and the underlying technology, but now we're also starting to talk about the rise in the enterprise value of these assets. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think it was notable that in IBM's earnings, for example, this week, they were really talking up what they offer in terms of blockchain, in terms of offering enterprises, particularly the banking industry, abilities to build private blockchains. And they say, look, we're better than anyone else. I mean, it's still a tiny portion of their revenue, but it's notable that they're really trying to talk up this part of the business. I think also we're starting to hear from other key players within the crypto space. I mean, Hyperledger's CEO, it's interesting, given the name Hyperledger, they're saying, well, the hype's actually coming out. They're seeing the enterprise value really starting to rise. They're saying, look, diamonds are being tracked by blockchain at the moment. They say trade finance is being actioned by a consortium of banks have done 7 real trades now in terms of trade finance cross-border. And interestingly, they're even like checking the supply chain of marijuana, would you have it? So clearly this is starting to be the underlying technology that's working, not just the crypto assets that everyone wants to talk about.
Peter, you've brought in a new head of security. What trends are you seeing in attempted hacks on your systems and others?
Yeah, so we're basically under constant sort of perpetual attack and have been for years. And I think for us, it's important to have someone internally who's really world-class to build that team and that function over the next few years. I think the security attacks only get worse. You know, I learned to sleep a few years ago. But yeah, it's definitely a huge part of the business and a huge part of our budget.
And talk to us about the kinds of attacks you're seeing. What are they after?
You know, the kinds of attacks I can talk about, we see everything from DDoS attacks, we see attacks from state-level actors, we see, you know, phishing attacks against our user bases, operational security requirements, data center requirements. There's really almost no end to the security vectors.
Are there any particular state actors like Russia that might be more active than others?
You know, it's not usually the ones that people guess, but that's something that we'll have to be a little tight-lipped about.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're getting some sleep. Peter Smith, CEO of Blockchain, thanks so much, as well as our very own Caroline Hyde in London. A story we are watching, Microsoft's cloud services helped the company beat estimates for profit and revenue during the fourth quarter. Sales of Microsoft's cloud service Azure rose 89%, while Office 365 revenue jumped 38%. The results caused shares to hit a record high Friday as Microsoft continues to cut into Amazon's cloud business. Coming up, SoftBank stakes a claim in China's fast-growing AI industry. Will China make its 2030 goal to become the world leader in artificial intelligence? This is Bloomberg. Though trade disputes continue to escalate between the U.S. and China still may be on its way to becoming the world leader in AI in the next few decades. SoftBank's Vision Fund is looking to invest almost $1 billion in the Chinese AR startup SenseTime, with core technologies aimed at improving China's vast surveillance systems and a push into autonomous cars. The startup is expected to fit right into Masayoshi Son's AI vision. Here to discuss further, we are joined by Techonomy CEO David Kirkpatrick and Bloomberg's Selena Wang. Selena, you helped break this story, and SenseTime is the most valuable private AI startup in the world. What do they do?
So this company is part of China's mass surveillance plan. They offer a lot of services to the government. So, for instance, in some provinces, they're able to look at all of the camera feeds and help identify people in criminal investigations. So, according to our sources, SoftBank is highly interested in investing about $1 billion into this company, which has already raised more than $1 billion just this year from backers like Alibaba, Qualcomm, and Silver Lake. So they're really in no desperate need for capital. But it fits perfectly into Masayoshi's plan of having a stake in these companies that are going to be a category leader. And given the fact that a lot of the services they provide wouldn't be allowed to be used by foreign companies, it's already well on its way to become increasingly more influential in China. And it's already the world's most valuable private AI company.
Now, David, you believe that Chinese artificial intelligence could develop faster than anywhere else. What makes you say that?
Well, it's all about scale. China is the world's most populous country. It's the largest internet community. And basically, the way AI is going to get better, among other things, is by applying the largest possible data sets to its development. China, almost by definition, is going to have the largest data sets in just about every category. So that is a significant fundamental advantage. When you look at the core AI technology, the software smarts, right now the US and China are sort of equivalent. Maybe the US is a little ahead. But when you look down the road and you look at the emphasis being put on this in China, and you look at the scale of the data that they have to work with, it's very likely that they will have fundamental advantages.
Selena, what is the view of the Vision Fund in China?
You know, what's interesting is that it's a pretty controversial fund, especially here in the United States. I'm sure you've spoken to many venture capitalists yourself who say it's sort of the vulture that comes sweeping in. They can offer seemingly limitless amount of capital, and they're a huge competitor, especially to some of these later stage firms that are used to being really the last check in these funds. What's interesting is that in China, it's seen as sort of the third non-biased option. If you're a startup in China and you want to grow, you want to get capital from either Alibaba or Tencent, but perhaps you don't want to have to be tied to one of their ecosystems. And if that's the case, SoftBank is a great, reputable third-party firm that you could get capital from. And especially in China, as David was saying, with such a huge population, such a huge consumer market, these companies can actually absorb the amount of capital that SoftBank wants to put in.
David, what's your view on this, given the trade tensions, given the pressure ratcheting up between the U.S. and China, and neither side backing down?
Well, it's interesting too to think about a company like Qualcomm's also in the same company. I think that there's a little bit of a cognitive dissonance in a way between what's happening on trade and what's happening on tech. There's more and more interest in Chinese technology because of just the reasons I said before and the quality of Chinese engineering. At the same time, we're very angry about their tariffs and about a lot of issues that center more around old economy issues, because frankly, that's what our government seems to focus on for the most part. I don't think our government and President Trump is totally ignorant about what's happening with tech, but when they talk about these trade issues and these national competitiveness issues, it sounds like they're talking about an economy of about 25 years ago.
We're looking at President Trump shaking hands with Masayoshi Son. Selena, you also have another story out about how Peter Thiel is now considering exploring making venture capital investments in China, which is a huge 180 for him because he's in the past been very disparaging of Chinese technology and the startup community. What do we know?
So the context to this is that you have a Trump ally that's seeking to do more investments in Chinese startups as the president is waging this trade war and escalating political tensions. But it's no surprise that Peter Thiel has interest investing in China. He, like many other venture capital firms, want a piece of that massive opportunity, that massive growth in China. We're seeing a lot more exits, multitudes of unicorn startups being created every year. As you said, he has made a complete 180. Just a few years ago, he wrote in his book that the easiest way for China to grow is to relentlessly copy what's already worked in the West. So according to our sources, he has really changed his perspective, and he's decided that there are actually a lot of new innovations in China, and that is borne out from what the market data shows. Just 5 years ago, 2 of the top 20 largest tech companies were in China, and now today there are 9. And he wants a piece of that.
David, any about face from Peter Thiel is always fascinating to unpick. What is your take here?
Well, it's an important about face, but I think it's smart from the standpoint of just making money, because it's not only the data advantages that we explained before, but Chinese government is way more supportive of domestic technology than our government is. They give a lot of fundamental advantages to it. There's a huge export push for Chinese technology. So I think, there will be tremendous gains from investing in Chinese tech companies. It is a spectacularly fraught with opportunity area right now.
Techonomy's David Kirkpatrick, you're going to be with us a bit later in the show. Bloomberg's Selena Wang, thank you so much. Great reporting. Coming up, what are the next breakthroughs in the biotech sector? We'll talk to Skip Fleshman with Asset Management Ventures, one of the oldest biotech venture capital firms in the country. And Bloomberg Tech is live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology, and be sure to follow our global breaking news network at TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. Biotech has historically been a volatile industry for investors. For every big win, there's a possible huge loss. But in the last few weeks, there's been a surge in biotech with fresh capital rushing in. Here to discuss, Skip Fleshman, partner at Asset Management Ventures. The firm is one of the longest running biotech venture capital firms in the United States. So it seems like biotech is the hot thing right now. Is it getting frothy? Is this real?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of interest from the biotech markets because the pharmaceutical companies and biotech firms don't have a really strong R&D pipeline, and so they're becoming acquisitive. It also leads to startups and early entrants with the ability to raise capital in the public markets.
You were an investor in Amgen back in the day. Where do you see potential now? What are the hot technologies that you're excited about?
Just to be clear, I wasn't the investor in 1980, but our founding partner, Pitch Johnson, was.
Your firm.
Yes, and so we're seeing some interesting opportunities in the digital health arena, so technologies applied into healthcare, and then other areas such as immuno-oncology and gene therapy.
So is that curing cancer?
Yeah, I think curing cancer is definitely the pipe dream. Detecting cancer early is one, and also trying to have some therapeutics that can actually cure it.
How has the competition and the landscape changed with more traditionally consumer tech venture capital firms getting into the biotech game, like Andreessen Horowitz, for example?
Yeah, Andreessen Horowitz has done a very nice job in some of their investments. I think for many, it's tricky because the healthcare ecosystem is extremely complex, and if you haven't taken the time to really understand how it works, it can be very daunting, and I think people can make some mistakes early.
Right. Do they get it? You know, DFJ, for example, gave Theranos one of its early checks.
Yes, I think many of them don't, to be honest. I think it's helpful to have a healthcare background, but also the flip side is true too. For healthcare firms, it's helpful to have the tech background as well, to understand AI, to understand data, mobile. That's very useful.
Has the Theranos explosion impacted your job at all? Are you doing anything differently?
I think for us, not really, because we focus on data. We want to see outcomes data. We want to see results. And I think Theranos was not a very transparent company. We want to see transparency from our founders. We want to see the clinical data, and they didn't have it.
What kind of team do you have behind the scenes to make sure you're making the right decisions?
Yeah, so I have one of my teammates is a PhD electrical engineer from Stanford, Rich Simoni, and then another one was a founder of a therapeutics company called CV Therapeutics. He's also a cardiologist by training.
So where do you see the volatility has been, you know, sort of an endemic part of investing in biotechnology? Is that going to continue?
Yeah, I think it was volatile for a while, but the last few years have been pretty hot, and we're seeing a lot of pharmaceutical companies very interested in the two sectors I identified, like gene therapy and immuno-oncology are two really hot sectors.
What's overhyped?
Well, there's always a lot of overhype in general markets, but I mean, for me, I'm looking so early now and more in the digital intervention sector. I think there's just a lot of frothiness, and we're seeing some companies that are getting a little bit too much capital too early. It's true in the tech sector as well.
So what kinds of companies are you most excited about?
Well, for me, I think what we can do in cancer is one area we just touched on. Cancer detection is one that's fascinating. And I think everybody's been affected by cancer at some level. And if you can detect cancer early, you can really, really help outcomes improve significantly. And so we're looking at a company, actually we're invested with Andreessen in a company named Freenome. And what Freenome does is they look at a blood sample and they analyze specific parts of the blood to see what kind of response is not really intuitive, and they use a lot of AI in the background to actually look for patterns in the blood that can detect cancer at stage 1.
So are you looking at patients who might have cancer? Or are you looking at anyone?
I mean, their first area they're going after is colorectal cancer, and so the idea is to do a very inexpensive blood draw as a preventative measure, and over time.
That's something that everyone would do, or only if
you
have an indication?
I think it'll be based on things that physicians already look at today. What is your family history, age, et cetera. So it'll be rolled out slowly, but we're hopeful that we can detect multi-cancers with one blood test.
There's also been concern that the cancer field could be overhyped. The curing cancer
Yeah, I mean, curing cancer is a whole different ballgame,
Yeah.
right? I think it's a really tricky place. There's a lot of hype around immuno-oncology. The great thing about it is it can be curative. The bad thing about it is sometimes it can be fatal because once you trigger the immune system to turn on, it will fight the tumors, but it may also fight healthy organs and liver, lung cancers, but also your heart or brain.
What about, you mentioned gene editing. Tell me a little bit more about where you see real potential there.
Well, gene editing is a pretty early sector, right? And so we've invested in a couple of companies. Adentis is one that's in the public markets.
What do they do?
They actually target orphan diseases, so they have 4 or 5 different areas that they're going after that are very, orphan disease means a very small market, but they're actually curing certain types of genetic diseases that can be fatal for young children.
Curing in babies that have yet to be born, or
No, these are for
Okay.
typically for children that, or even adults that have the disease itself.
So, what's going to be possible in 10 years that isn't today? If you're on the front edges of this.
Yeah, I think what will be possible is detecting cancer early, treating it with some immuno-oncology, but I also think the chronic disease area is really interesting too, and that's where we're seeing the digital world begin to intersect with healthcare. And we're taking these behavioral signals that we get, we're taking external signals that we're getting, like contextual, what's happening in the weather, and we're able to influence people's chronic illness. Could be respiratory illness, asthma, COPD, could be diabetes. It could be behavioral problems such as depression or opioid addiction. We think we can take the digital data that we have and improve people's lives long term.
Do you think we need better regulation to make sure a Theranos doesn't happen again?
For Theranos, I mean, it's...
Or companies making, in general, false promises?
Yeah, I do. Well, regulation maybe not. I think the venture community is wising up to stuff like this. I think it's in the tech sector as well. We're seeing some of this. We're maybe a little bit of overhype without the ability to deliver long term.
All right, Skip Fleshman with Asset Management Ventures. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for stopping by. Well, Facebook's WhatsApp payment services rolled out in India stalled after the government questioned how the data of the app's 230 million local users will be stored. People familiar with the matter said. Its beta trial had drawn almost 1 million people since February. A delay could help Alibaba-backed local market leader Paytm and Google's Tez. Coming up, the warnings are picking up in both the public and private sector. Hackers attempting to interfere once again in the 2018 midterm elections. We'll speak to the CEO of Cloudflare about what they are doing to prevent breaches next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. This week, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein spoke at the Aspen Security Forum in Colorado and continued to warn that the U.S. is facing the threat of cyber attacks from Russia and beyond.
Advancing technology will enable adversaries to create propaganda in new and unforeseen ways. Our government must continue to identify and counter them. Exposing schemes to the public is an important way to neutralize them. The American people have a right to know if foreign governments are targeting them with propaganda.
Meantime, the cybersecurity firm Cloudflare is offering a free service called the Athenian Project to election authorities leading up to the 2018 midterms. For more, we are joined now by Cloudflare CEO Matthew Prince. So how exactly does your technology work?
Well, we run one of the largest networks in the world, and for big companies, they pay us millions of dollars to help protect their networks. And I think that our entire company, which was started in the United States, watched as we saw technology being used to really undermine democracy in the United States. And we thought, is there something that we can do to help protect what is actually a fairly vulnerable institution, which are the individuals charged around the country with ensuring that elections go off smoothly and that you can trust in their results.
So how does the Athenian Project actually work?
The Athenian Project takes the services that we would typically, sell to very large large like financial institutions, other organizations, and says we'll offer that for free to any government or any institution that is helping protect democracy and ensure elections within the United States. And so that helps protect against things like denial of service attacks, hacking attempts, different ways that hackers and other people trying to disrupt elections might try and either steal data or influence the outcome of those elections.
We're getting signals from the private sector, Microsoft and others, saying that they're already seeing signs that Russia is hacking our midterms already. Are you seeing that?
Well, we're seeing attacks. We don't spend a lot of time on attribution. What I can say is that as we've learned more about the signatures of the attacks that have come up through the Mueller investigation and others, that we've seen similar attacks that have been targeting other states that are being protected by the Athenian Project. But it's not, I think, just Russians. What's challenging is that I think that there had always been a sense that U.S. democracy was something that was very stable and that you really couldn't influence. And unfortunately, since the 2016 election, I think a little bit of the bloom is off that rose. And so more and more entities, whether those are foreign or domestic, are looking at ways to use disrupting elections in order to undermine the U.S.'s core democratic principles.
I want to unpick that a little bit because in the break we were talking about how the U.S. historically hasn't been a target of election hacks while other countries have. What are the trends you've seen, let's say, over the last decade?
Yeah, so Cloudflare has been protecting candidates and election sites around the world for the last 8 years. And around the rest of the world, especially in the developing world, cyber attacks were a big part of elections, where I can remember back in 2014 where we were involved in a Mexican presidential election and we were on both sides of that. And you saw major attacks targeting both sides. And, you know, it's pure speculation on my part, but I think that part of that was in parts of the world where democracy is newer, if you could undercut those institutions, then it could call into question the results of whatever the election was and make it harder for the winner to actually govern. I think in the US, there was a perception that actually democracy was really stable. And so there was less cyber attacks to try and target those institutions. Unfortunately, I think since 2016, there's more of a perception that you can influence elections by actually undercutting the infrastructure that provides them. And so we've actually seen a dramatic rise in attacks in the United States, where the US has kind of caught up with a lot of the rest of the world.
And if it's not just the Russians, who else is it?
I mean, it could be anyone. It could be, you know, somebody who just doesn't like, you know, who it could be a kid in a basement in Ohio who wants to get their name in the newspaper. It could be foreign actors trying to influence the elections. What's been interesting, I think, is that what we can see is less that it's about influencing the outcome in one direction or another, saying, I want Party A or Party B to win, but instead undercutting the process itself. So for instance, we see a lot of attacks on voter registration sites. And why that's insidious is because if you can stop people from being able to vote, then that means that whoever loses the election can say the election didn't have legitimacy. And that makes it harder for the candidate that did win to actually be able to govern going forward. And so what we think with the Athenian Project at Cloudflare is how can we help protect those critical pieces of infrastructure to make sure that democracy has legitimacy.
Do you see any spike in activity as a result of President Trump's lack of admission here, or any, do you see trends that coincide with the news cycle and what comes out of the president's mouth, what comes across in a tweet or from the White House?
What I think I would correlate trends to is that the higher profile an election is, the more that you see attacks that are targeting it. So for instance, when there was a special Senate election in Alabama, we helped protect the infrastructure there, and that was a very high profile election, and you saw a significantly higher amount of targeting. And so I think as there is more attention on the midterm elections, that's going to drive more and more targeted attacks by hackers around the world.
You're working with Alabama, Hawaii, Idaho, North Carolina, Rhode Island, and more. It's progress, but it's probably a drop in the bucket compared to what needs to be done. Is our system ready?
There are 8,500 different jurisdictions that manage elections, and elections are a very local business in this country. And what's been powerful about this, we're working with about 70 of them around the world, which, as you said, is a drop in the bucket. But it's been powerful to talk with those individuals that are managing the elections. And they span the political spectrum, obviously, from deep red states to deep blue states. But across the board, these are heroes. These are people that are real patriots. And when you talk to them, it feels like them very lonely against, at times, the entire Russian cyber defense. And so, we've been really proud as a company to help support those individuals across the partisan divide to say, let's make sure that elections have integrity. And that's something that we can't all agree on.
What are the hackers actually trying to do? We've talked about sowing discord, but everyone has sort of stopped short of saying any hacker has been able to change the result. When it comes to hacking these systems, what are the hackers actually accomplishing?
Well, I think that, again, you don't have to actually change the results in order to have an effect. What's challenging about this is if you make people believe less in the process, believe less in democracy itself, then that undercuts whoever wins the election. And so if you are a foreign entity and you're trying to make it harder for people to govern, if you make it harder for someone to register to vote, for someone to be able to figure out where their polling place is, for somebody to trust that the results are the actual results, that undercuts democracy itself, and that's what we see a lot of the attacks seeming to target. And again, you don't have to change the results to actually have a really corrosive effect on how we govern this country.
So a return to completely paper ballots wouldn't help here?
And so, when the challenge is that you can target things beyond what happens in the voting booth to create discord. So for instance, you used to look in the newspaper to figure out where your polling place was. Now you go online. If you went online and you couldn't figure out where your polling place was, then all of a sudden that makes it harder for people to actually go and vote. So there's a lot to the election process that's more than what happens in that voting booth. And that entire system has to have integrity in order for elections to have integrity. We don't do much to help protect what goes on in that voting booth, but we do think that we can help states and local governments protect all of the rest of the infrastructure that has to exist in order for democracy to work.
So you have the Athenium Project. Federal authorities are working on allocating money to these different jurisdictions, but in your view, how much better prepared will U.S. election systems be than they were in 2016, or will the threat be even bigger?
Well, I think that there will be more preparation, and we're doing our part, again, donating these services pro bono to any states or local officials around the world. And we've worked with, again, across the political spectrum, and I hope we'll be able to do that more. And what I actually really hope is that other technology companies, there's been a lot of news about technology companies being used to undermine democracy, but I hope that this is an inspiration for other technology companies to say, listen, we've built this institution, we've built these businesses that turn into just incredibly successful businesses on a foundation of a stable country and a stable democracy. And so we have actually a patriotic duty to actually stand up and help protect that democracy. And so I think that organizations will be more prepared than they have before, but unfortunately, I think the risk is going to be a lot higher than it ever has before.
Cloudflare CEO Matthew Pridge offering the Athenium Project technology for free to U.S. election systems across the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for stopping by. Coming up, free speech on Facebook. Does the social media site protect Holocaust deniers? We're going to talk about CEO Mark Zuckerberg's clarification about his earlier remarks. That is next. And this weekend on Bloomberg Television, we'll bring you our best interviews from the week, including our exclusive conversation with Brad Parscale, President Trump's 2020 campaign manager, about the groundwork he's laying for the election amidst concerns about Russian meddling. Tune in this Saturday for the best of Bloomberg technology. This is Bloomberg. Continuing with a look at tech's effect on elections, Facebook has suspended an app tied to a data analysis firm running an election study. The company Crimson Hexagon has ties to U.S. government agencies, as well as a Russian nonprofit with ties to the Kremlin. to the Kremlin. Facebook says it's investigating to see if Crimson Hexagon has violated any of its policies. Back with me now to discuss this as well as other big headlines from the week in tech, Techonomy CEO David Kirkpatrick. David, this is fascinating. Crimson Hexagon is a name that, I've certainly heard. It's a company that works with a lot of different companies out there. What do you make of the fact that this is something that Facebook is continuing to fight, and that they only suspended Crimson Hexagon after an inquiry from the Wall Street Journal?
Right. You just hit the thing that most concerns me at the very end of that question. I wrote a piece on Techonomy that just came out today about my concerns about the things that didn't come up in Zuckerberg's interview this week with Kara Swisher of Recode. And, one of them is how much they're willing to spend to solve these problems. If they're waiting for the press to turn up the issues that they need to address, we're not going to address all the issues. I mean, that was also evidenced in a statement they made this week about how they're going to do this new experimental social order application that they're going to test in Sri Lanka and Myanmar. Well, why are they testing it in those two countries? Because those are the two that the New York Times has written about, that there's disasters happening because of Facebook. There's plenty of other countries. They're really just sort of putting out fires that are set by people like us, rather than spending some of their 20+ billion in profits this year alone to get ahead of this stuff.
Cambridge Analytica was also raised by the media. I mean, at this point, Facebook has worked with so many different companies. I mean, do you think that this is something that they can even get a handle on internally? I mean, they're talking about they don't know what Crimson Hexagon's relationship and contracts with the government are. Well, they don't know what any of the companies they work with, what relationships they have with other organizations.
Yeah, well, that's a very legitimate point, except, again, this is a company with 43% net margins and revenues of over $55 billion a year this year. So why don't they start their own internal investigative journalism unit and start doing this work for us instead of waiting for everybody to turn out? Look, there's tons of these problems. Believe me, if they just sit around waiting for the press to write about them, they're going to be writing about new ones every week. They clearly have not been imposing sufficient governance on their company. And I agree. They've gotten themselves into a serious pickle because they basically expanded into all these geographies with a system that basically wasn't well governed. And that is on them, and they need to fix it. Now, it's not going to be cheap or simple or easy to fix. And frankly, in my opinion, investors that keep bidding up its stock need to think about that.
Now, let's talk about that interview that Zuckerberg did with Kara Swisher of Recode this week. Of course, the most talked about statement, what he had to say about Holocaust deniers. At this point, Holocaust denial is still allowed on Facebook's platform, and he used that to, talk about how it doesn't make him feel very good, especially as a Jewish American. But he's not going to be the decider of whether that stays or goes. People are up in arms about this. He clarified, but the policy hasn't changed.
Well, as Farhad Manjoo explained in the New York Times today, and as I also wrote in this article on Techonomy, their whole set of guidelines are very muddled. Very hard for people to know what is and is not allowed. Very hard to know how they actually enforce the rules they do have. They seem to change them very frequently. I think it's really also indicative of Zuckerberg's inability to really be explaining himself very clearly. He brought up that Holocaust denial thing himself. Kara Swisher didn't even ask him about it. What about shooting yourself in the foot? I mean, I think that was a great interview. And here's the thing. Facebook is still massively profitable because advertisers have no choice. That's a great thing. There's wonderful things about Facebook. It allows all kinds of great things for the world. But it has got serious problems that need better management and governance, and they are not stepping up sufficiently. And I think that came through in that interview as well.
Now, I had a fascinating conversation with Brad Parscale, President Trump's 2020 campaign manager, who ran the digital campaign for then candidate Trump. He talked about how it would have been really tough to win the election without Facebook, then talked about how he believes that companies like Facebook and Twitter are still biased in the opposite direction. Take a listen to what Parscale told me.
It's up to me to be a person as a leader in our party and someone that's running the campaign to make sure that those companies are held accountable, that they do everything they can to try to kill those internal biases and to provide an even playing field for this country.
So he's saying there that Facebook and Twitter have internal biases, which is so ironic given that in the same breath he's saying that Facebook helped them win the election. But you have on all sides, whether it's the liberals accusing Facebook of being biased or the conservatives accusing Facebook of being biased. How does Facebook figure this out, even admitting that it is, in a way, not just a tech company, but also a media company that does have responsibility for the content on its platform?
Well, how they figure all these things out is a complicated question that we all ought to be helping them with, and that they need to create a global discussion, event to bring in experts. There's so many things they need to do to figure out the answer to that. But I will say, as somebody who's been studying Facebook closely for 12 years, I absolutely and wholeheartedly reject the notion that there's any intrinsic fundamental bias in any ideological direction. It is just opportunism for right-wingers to say that. And it is just plain not true. Everyone thinks Facebook is biased against them. And frankly, if that were true, why would Facebook be contributing to the election of right-wing candidates all over the world, including in our country? It just doesn't follow. Everybody thinks Facebook's biased because it's a complicated system that's hard to understand. But it is not true. It is just opportunism that they say that.
David Kirkpatrick, CEO of Techonomy, as always, giving it to us straight. Thanks so much, David. Coming up, in the shadow of SpaceX and Blue Origin, there is another commercial space startup that's attempting to make affordable launch services. We'll have details on that next. This is Bloomberg. Peter Beck is the real-life rocket man. He loves rockets so much that he started Rocket Lab, a space startup specializing in lightweight, cost-effective commercial launch services. His goal, to make launching rockets into orbit as common as picking up your mail. And he's making progress. Check it out.
I think I'm the only non-billionaire that's doing this. I mean, you've got Jeff, you've got Richard Branson, you've got Elon, and then you got me. I mean, how is it that a guy from the bottom of New Zealand that was once coined by Mick Jagger as the bumhole of the planet can launch stuff into orbit? How crazy is that?
Peter Beck really likes rockets.
Monopropellant and bipropellant liquid rocket engines, hybrids, the sheer challenge of the engineering, the problems that you have to solve, it's kind of what gets me going.
So much so that he started Rocket Lab, a small new space startup, often living in the shadow of the bigger companies like SpaceX. But Peter's mission is a little closer to home than Mars. With Rocket Lab, Peter aims to make launching rockets into orbit as common as picking up your mail.
The most important thing that can be done in space right now is to make space a domain that everybody can access. We started on day one with an absolute clean sheet paper, and we wrote 2 requirements on that piece of paper, and that was must be launched really, really frequently and must be affordable. But the most important thing here is getting to orbit like a freight train, just getting to orbit so frequently that you can use space as a domain to build commercial infrastructure. So that's things like put an internet in space, so that every square inch of the planet has internet, and that's truly game-changing for developing countries.
Peter always knew he'd do this for a living one day, even when his guidance counselor disagreed.
My parents were called into the school. They believed that my aspirations for a career were totally ridiculous and unachievable, and that I should pursue a trade in plumbing because I was quite good at my hands.
Peter ignored this advice and instead built this, a rocket bike.
I did about 100 miles an hour in an eighth of a mile. It's an amazing feeling, actually. It's an ever-increasing acceleration, so where you point is where you go, and you just hold on.
2 decades later, Peter has a staff of over 200, and Rocket Lab is 5 launches away from being in the black.
We successfully completed all our test flights, and we're now into full commercial operations. We're trying to get to launch 1 a month this year, and then next year we'll try and get to 1 every 2 weeks, and then we'll keep doubling down on that.
Rocket Lab's secret? Innovation. They were the first to replace aluminum with stronger and lighter materials like carbon fiber, as well as employ radical production techniques like 3D printing.
We've got a factory full of rockets, and we started 3D printing engines when people were making bottle openers and cats' prosthetics. Nowadays, if you look at all the startup space companies, they're all printing their rocket engines.
And they have one more little secret: location.
The great thing about New Zealand is it's a small island nation in the middle of nowhere. So that launch site is the only private orbital launch site in the entire world, and it has more launch availability than America does as a country. The biggest thing to be done in space is yet to even be thought of, because nobody's had access to the domain to be able to experiment and innovate. We're just getting started. The definition of success for me is to receive a text message from one of my staff saying, "Hope you enjoyed your lunch, Pete. By the way, another one launched, another one on the pad." If we can get to that point where launch is that commonplace, that uninteresting and that frequent, then the world that we all live in is definitely an incredibly different place.
Maybe a better place.
I certainly hope a better place. It would be a total fail if it's a worse place.
That was the latest episode of Game Changers. You can check out the full series at Bloomberg.com. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. All next week, we'll have full coverage and analysis of tech earnings. Alphabet, Facebook, PayPal, and Intel, just some of the firms reporting. Happy Friday. Have a wonderful weekend. We will see you next week. That's all for now. This is Bloomberg.